I think Jews were brilliant at telling stories, but we're terrible at telling our own story.
Yes.
And especially
I
at telling the story of Israel. We are an absolute failure at that.
This is a Visegrad 24 series about the Israel-Hamas War.
I'm Stefan Tompson. We're here with another Visegrad 24 interview. We're on the ground in Israel, meeting with Israelis and the Jewish diaspora who's been traveling here to show support for Israel. And today we're speaking with Martín Varsavsky. He's a 5-time unicorn founder. He owns one of the biggest fertility clinics in the United States of America. He also happens to be a board member of Axel Springer. Martín, thank you so much for being here.
I'm happy to be here and in Tel Aviv.
The first question I want to ask you is about your political orientation. I know that a lot of the friends that I have in the United States who've been Jews, who've been often more traditionally to the left, have had a very big change of heart. What have your perspectives been since September 7th? What's happened?
Well, I used to be on the board of the Clinton Foundation, and I was a donor to the Democratic Party, and I always favored Democrat. But what happened after October 7th was not only a shock in Israel, it was a shock in the United States and in Europe as well. I spent my life between Europe and the US, and it was incredible for me to see the position of some people in the Democratic Party, including people at universities, including the university president saying that they're calling for the genocide of Jews may be harassment depending on the context, and all these things that happened that blew my mind. And they represent a significant portion of the Democratic Party. And then also that in general, the Democratic Party, which used to be for, let's say, progress, and it was called progressives, the people who voted Democrats, I believe now that it's more the party of the unions and the party of things to stay the same. And I believe that if you want to be progressive, which is what I always wanted to be, to embrace the future, embrace technology, embrace modernity, what you see in America is that cities that are progressive turn out to be conservative. For example, San Francisco and all its policies to suppress new technologies, New York with this Amazon fight that it had an opportunity to get Amazon and it became so political, and the progressive cities became anti-modernity and anti-new tech, and then the conservatives, like people in Houston, people in Austin, people in Miami, became progressive in the sense that they adopt new technologies. So I ended up moving the headquarters of Prelude, for our fertility company, from New York to Houston. The headquarters of Gamito, which makes fertility medication, from New York, it's moving to Austin. There's a reversal of roles. So I think it will take time for people to call the policies of Texas and Florida progressive, especially because sometimes they get involved in issues that are clearly not progressive, like, for example, the views on abortion and certain views that are unfortunately clearly not progressive. But in terms of business, openness for the future, that's why you see Elon Musk moving from California to Austin. You see Jeff Bezos moving from the Northwest to Miami. You see sort of like an overall trend towards states that are in theory conservative but are in practice progressive.
The Jewish people very often, as themselves a discriminated group, end up shifting towards social justice and towards social activism. And this is a trend that we've seen for decades. And suddenly, now that we have October 7th, we have a war with Hamas, we're seeing people in the United States of America show open support for Palestine, if not for Hamas, show open support to the Houthis who are busy bombing our trade routes.
That's insane.
Do you have a sense of betrayal from the left?
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
I believe that Jewish people spent an incredible amount of time, empathy, resources, helping the American civil liberties movement, helping Martin Luther King, and then when it's time to help us, I think that nobody helps us, and they consider us white in an insulting way, as if being white was an insult, which is also horrible. And it's also not true in the identity politics, because we're here in Israel now, and the majority of the citizens of Israel don't come from Europe, which is a confusion that the left has, as they see Israel as a European colony in the Middle East, when the majority of the citizens of Israel come from displaced Arab countries that forced them to emigrate to Israel. I'm talking about Iraqi Jews and Iranian Jews and Moroccan Jews and Libyan Jews and Algerian Jews, like the Jews of, traditionally Jews are Ashkenazim or Sephardic, and the mostly Sephardic Jews are the majority of Jews, and so it is clearly not the case that Israel is like a white nation as perceived by identity politics, and a lot of Jewish people are from Arab countries. And so it's just a misconception and a betrayal on a group of people who are now suffering the horrible massacre of October 7th, which is being ignored, partly because social media don't want to show the graphic images, but the graphic images are it's kind of like not to show the moon landing to people who don't believe we went to the moon. Here we have to show the graphic images. It's sad and terrible, but it's the truth, right? And so that's been covered. And then there's the Hamas propaganda, the exaggeration of Shifa Hospital, 500 dead in 10 minutes reported, which turned out not to be true, but was on the Washington Post, was on the New York Times. There's been tremendous concerted effort by the so-called progressives in destroying the image of Israel and promoting the myths of genocide. I mean, obviously there is no genocide. There were 700,000 Arabs in what is now Israel, so-called later Palestine, and these Palestinians are now 9 million, 2 million in Israel, 2 million in Gaza, 3 million in the West Bank, 2 million in Jordan. And instead, Jews, we were 10 million in Europe in 1939. Now we're 1 million. That is a genocide, of which 6 million died in the Holocaust, and of the 4 million surviving, 3 million emigrated. There is a hostile environment for Jews in many places of Europe now. So what the enemies of Israel attribute to Jews is not the case, but what is the case is that Jews face discriminatory policies, try to walk around with a kippah or being like an Orthodox Jew, which I am not, but I completely empathize. In many places in Europe, they would be subject to acts of aggression. You would be discriminated against. So it's kind of like a reversal of justice, what's going on. And so I shifted to the right or to other sectors which are open-minded. And in my native Argentina, we saw something similar. I grew up in Argentina. I'm an Argentine citizen originally. And Argentina has had a shift to the right with a president that wants to convert to Judaism, Milei, and who's opening up the economy after so many years of Peronism, which is kind of a populist socialism. So there is, if you're Jewish now, you have to embrace the forces that normally you would have rejected 30 years ago. But now the political landscape has completely changed. And I think that to be a leftist Jew is to invite your enemies to your home.
Martin, what's the thing that makes you proudest of being a Jew? What are you most proud of?
It's kind of, when you grow up Jewish, it's kind of a mixed story, right? On one side, when you celebrate Passover or There's always like they enslaved us, they killed us. It's not a happy story. It's not easy to be Jewish at all. I had my children ask me, why are we Jewish? It seems to be that you're many times on the losing end of history. And we're only 15 million, meaning one person in 500 in a world of 8 billion. 2.4 billion are Christians and 2 billion are Muslims. We're nobodies in this world in terms of quantity. But then comes the other side of being Jewish, which is the hard work, your grandparents telling you to study, your parents telling you to study, to study, to study. And I have 3 university degrees and 5 unicorns, and this thing that because you're told that you're a failure and you're a nobody, you want to really make it. You want to prove the world that you deserve to be alive. That's already a big one, considering how many people want us dead. And that you deserve to be recognized. And so in this oppression and anti-Semitism, out of that comes an incredible strength that can lead to situations like 1 person in 500 is Jewish, but 1 in 5 of the science Nobel Prizes are Jews. And my dad was an astrophysicist from a PhD at Harvard. I come from a family of scientists. The fact that so many Jews have been involved in discoveries, in medicine, in biology, in physics, in chemistry, but also in literature, in movie making. And so there's the dark side of being Jewish, anti-Semitism and hatred, but there's the positive side, which is those negative evolutionary forces that force you to evolve somehow super well to cope with all the evolutionary pressures that Jews have, which I believe are greater than the ones of non-Jews.
Do Jews run the world?
If we didn't, there wouldn't be so much negative press about us. I believe that no, the answer is clearly no, but also not even the media. I think Jews were brilliant at telling stories, and we're amazing. We wrote the Bible, and we wrote all these other incredible stories, and we win Oscars and everything, but we're terrible at telling our own story.
Yes.
And especially
I
at telling the story of Israel. We are an absolute failure at that.
The Jewish minority has been incredibly successful at many things and has overachieved in many sectors. And that's undeniable. And including there is a strong representation of the Jewish community in American media, in Hollywood. Why is it that with this strong overrepresentation, that the media is so biased against Israel?
Well, I think Israel itself does a very poor job at telling its own story because of a contradiction of how you have to portray yourself in this part of the world, in Israel, where you and I are right now, which is that if you show any weakness, your adversaries destroy you. And so you have to boast and you have to brag. In fact, Israel won the wars of independence, and sometimes by building tanks out of wood boxes that it didn't have and just trying to show we have all these tanks. And 1 tank would fire and 5 other tanks would be there, and they were not really tanks, right? So you have to kind of lie about how strong you are. The truth is that Israel is not as strong as people think. Israel is not fighting Hamas. Israel is fighting Iran, Russia, and China. And I think for little Israel to fight Iran, Russia, and China, because you can see that Hamas is funded by Iran, which is supported by Russia and China. You can see the Houthis are funded by Iran, which are supported by Russia and China. And when you really study the situation, the David and Goliath story, Israel is David. It's not Goliath like the American media shows. And so it is a contradiction. Israel has to appear strong here, and it boasts and it brags. And then the rest of the world kind of believes the story that Israel is Goliath and Hamas is David, right? And then everybody's with David, right? Outside of Europe, USA, they're always with the little guy.
Yeah.
The little guy. And Israel should finally be honest and say, we are the little guy, okay? We go against, we're 9 million people here against 2 billion who are around us, who frankly mostly hate us. And if they could push a button at night, they would destroy us. And many would press the button during the day, like Hamas, and exterminate Jews. So I think it is a failure of portrayal, but I think it has to do with the Israeli government trying to appear very strong in the region. And that image translates to Europe as USA, as Israel is the strong guy, the Hamas is the little guy, and they have sympathy from the little guy, and they don't see that Hamas is a proxy for Iran, which is supported by Russia and China, and that Israel is fighting the biggest enemies in the world.
I'm a representative very much of a new brand of media, of a new perhaps even school of media, of being essentially exclusively online. There's no paper element. The website is much less important to us than the work that we do on social media. And yet, I mean, we've generated in the last 3 months since October 7th over 3.2 billion impressions. We've had sort of outsized influence in comparison to the scale of the team that we are, which is a very small team. And I wanted to ask, as someone who comes from the perspective of being a board member of Axel Springer, which is one of the biggest media organizations in the world, what's your take on the media, and how has what you've seen, with the reporting that you've seen on a subject that you're obviously very emotional and passionate about, and that you, I mean, it's a heartfelt thing to you, right, Israel? So what you would have seen over the last 3 months, I'm sure has that impacted your understanding of media?
Well, I think media itself is undergoing a radical change. It's been going for maybe 25 years and it hasn't finished. I think what you guys do is at the forefront of what's coming. I think not only because of going away from not only paper but TV, right? Like the movement away from paper, that's an old story, but the movement away from big screens to little screens is still ongoing. And then the distribution, which used to be a distribution through paper, then broadcasting, meaning that one antenna hits millions of people with the same content. Then came cable, which was a fragmented distribution, but not so fragmented. Maybe you could say you had 500 channels, but now on the internet and the apps you have millions. And so this fragmentation of media becomes very difficult for traditional companies to deal with, because they just don't know where to find the people, right? They lost the connection. You had one antenna, millions of people. Now you have millions of antennas, millions of people, right? It's almost like a personal broadcasting service. And so what you guys do is to find your audiences, fine-tune the messages, find your audiences, grow your audiences, in a moment in which you have an opportunity, because there's some boundaries that traditional media, they don't want to cross. But not they don't want to cross because of the type of content you place, which in my opinion is mostly very readable and reasonable. But it's not, you don't do what certain people in new media do, which is sensationalist and untrue. That you stick to the true. What you post is true, which that already, at least you try to make it true. I'm sure you can make a mistake too, but you have an aim for objectivity, which that we share. But the problem with that some large media companies have is that they have a cadre of professional journalists that are almost in a way acting in unison many times and not acting individually, meaning that they tend to have a herd instinct, that they all move like a herd, and they don't many times want to disagree with fellow journalists. They see journalism as in an almost unionized way. And so when you have an independent voice that's not tied to an editorial line, but you can have your own voice, you have an opportunity. And that's why you have seen the rise of also certain podcasters like Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, and others, that they have an opportunity by themselves to drive enormous audiences just because they're more like just the way they are. And they ask the questions that come to their mind, and they relate to the interviewed person in a personal way, and so the audience identifies with them asking the questions. And so I think and then there's Spotify, let's say Daniel Ek, who I know personally, and I've seen from the very beginning of Spotify, how Spotify has evolved. And in the consumption of audio, there's also a revolution going on. It's because it started with you had to buy your own CD. Then it went that you could find all the music in one place. And then it came that people kind of stopped being only interested in music, and they became interested in podcasts. Then podcast became a big thing, which podcasts really relate to the origin of radio, right? It's like radio coming back in the form of a podcast. And then there was a transition that started at other places, at Audible and Everread, but now Everrand, which used to be Script, which is audiobooks. And now Spotify got into audiobooks. And then people started getting used to longer formats. So first in TikTok, like 90 seconds. But then somebody like Lex Friedman comes and says, I'm going to talk to someone for 3 hours. And then people listen for 3 hours.
Yeah.
And so there's more and more experimentation on formats. Twitter, which started with 140 characters, one of the big changes that Elon Musk made that is very successful is to end the limitation of format. Now you can post long videos. When you look at what Bill Ackman has been doing, it's been very long formats, right?
Long.
He writes,
very long.
It's like, is this Twitter? Like I'm reading like something that is longer. Yes,
you keep reading, and Bill Ackman's still writing.
But he's successful at that, which shows that you can be extremely precise and you can write something. He writes very well too, and you can write something in very long format. So now people are realizing that it's not only clickbaiting, it's not only short things, it's not only. But it's kind of like the difference between Netflix and TikTok, right? That, like, I'm a dad of 7. I have 7 children, and I tell my younger children, I finally say to them, look, if you're going to see video, watch Netflix, okay? Why? Or watch HBO, or Disney, or others. Why? Because at least in long format, my 10-year-old has to hold his attention level for an hour and a half, for an hour.
Yes.
It's not this like, this constant swiping
Doom scrolling.
And so I am very aware of all these different trends. I'm going back to Axel Springer. My role at the board of Axel Springer, I'm the only non-German on the board. I'm the only Jewish person on the board. And my role is none of those things. My role is not to represent non-Germans, not to represent Jews, but is to represent, weirdly at my age, but represent the digital side of the business, and to because I was one of the pioneers of the internet, and to help the company transition 100% towards a digital environment, and to embrace all the different formats that I just mentioned.
Interestingly, as you say, that because you're in your 60s, right?
Yes.
That they hired someone.
That I should be the one.
Yeah, there's something quite
I know.
unique about that.
A lot of the things I do in my life are kind of asynchronous with my age.
I wanted to ask you, what is your take on Israel, and why is Israel the only Western nation in the world to have birth rate above replacement levels?
Well, immigration certainly played a big role, right? And Israel, there's something in Israel that's called the law of return, right? And the law of return embraces a form of Judaism that has been rejected by the Orthodox, but it's, I believe, a wonderful embracement of Judaism, because Judaism was only through the mother,
Yes.
but the state of Israel said it's through the mother and through the father, right? And the law of return allows people who have a non-Jewish mother but a Jewish father also to be considered Jews. So Israel, the state of Israel, smartly expanded the definition of Judaism, because the problem of Judaism and why we're only 15 million now is not only because of the Holocaust, that certainly played a big role, and we're the same amount of Jews now than in 1939 in the whole world, but it also because it's just so hard to become Jewish, right? It's hard to convert. It's hard because you either your parents are Jewish, but then it's only your mom, and just like too many complicated things. So first of all, the state of Israel with the law of return made it much easier to be considered Jewish. So a lot of Russian Jews and a lot of who had maybe one parent that was Jewish were able to come. So Israel grew a lot through immigration. But then there's also something amazing, really, and unique that happens in Israel, which is that Israel is the ancestral land of Jews, and Jews feel a special connection to this country. Like I never lived in Israel, and I feel a special connection to this country. And so fertility also has to do with the fact that people say we are in our ancestral home, we want to be here, we want to remain here. The Orthodox Jews are the ones driving the fertility. They have an inordinate or incredible amount of children, which is kind of a problem for Israel, by the way, because they also don't serve normally, don't serve in the army, normally don't participate much in the economy. They're supposed to be the Jews who carry the spirit of Judaism, but the problem is that you need spirit and you need bread, right? And they don't contribute to the economy of Israel in any significant way. That has to change. But yeah, in the end, there's a great deal of population growth to the tune of 7 million Jews. But having said this, the Palestinians were 700,000 in 1948, and now they're 9 million. So this seems to be a neighborhood thing, that people have more children.
And the fertility in the West.
First of all, let's say fertility in the West is in serious decline, right? The population, without immigrants, the population of the United States will grow old and shrink. Without immigration, the population of Europe will grow old and shrink. Certainly Spain, Italy, well, all of Europe. And China has a population implosion, and it's incredible. Korea, Japan, like the world, except for Africa and the Middle East, the world population is imploding, right? Now, the work we do in fertility, I personally don't believe the solution is immigration, in the sense that I believe not only that people have a certain national identity that they like to keep, but also it's not even fair to say, well, why don't we outsource having children to other people? It just makes no sense to me. So I believe the solution is for the people in the country to have children. But why is it that they don't have children? Well, I believe that baby boomers had a connection between their biology and their psychology. In their 20s, they wanted to have children. And when you want to have children in your 20s, the biology works very well. We're very successful. Teenagers are many times unwantingly successful at having children. And so fertility declines with age. Everyone knows that. And now we have disconnected our biology and our psychology, meaning that when we are ready to have children biologically, we don't want them. And when we want them, our biology doesn't work anymore. And the job of my fertility companies is to reconnect the biology and the psychology of people, meaning that then when they're ready, they're successful. And for that, we have IVF, we have egg freezing, and we have a number of technologies that can allow a woman, for example, who's 30 to freeze her eggs and then to successfully have babies in the late 30s and 40s, which is when people want to have them. And a third of them right now, a third fail over their whole life. So that's pretty depressing, and that's why we have such few children. Well, because having a baby at 39 is just very difficult, because eggs, it's not a problem of the uterus. That's why it's so, egg freezing is so successful when done properly and with enough cycles. And that is because the uterus of a woman could have babies in her 60s because of the uterus. The problem is the eggs, the ovaries. And that's something we study also at Gamito. Why is it that humans are among the only animals that have menopause and that their ovaries age in the middle of their life? Okay, there's theories about this. There's a theory about grandmotherhood, and that humans evolved for grandparents to take care of the children, so the grandparents don't want to compete continuing to have children. And there's theories, that's a theory, we don't know if it's the case, but we know menopause is the case. And so a woman who looks great at 42 and is beautiful and attractive and sexy and everything seems great, but her ovaries are like she was 80, right? And so that's what. But if you have eggs from the same woman of when she was 30, then she'll have a baby at 42 with no problem. And that's what we work on.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.